I want to tell you a story, and it's based on my personal belief that you should never sell a freehold, right? Because what you find is that I'd say 95% of people in the UK, maybe more, will do what this young professional couple are planning to do that I know. In other words, they're quite fairly early in their careers. They're kind of late 20s. They happened to have bought a property a few years ago, made quite a good capital gain on it, and now they're looking to the next step. And for them, it's to move somewhere else, not too far from where they live now, maybe 10, 15 miles away, and get a bigger house, and maybe in a few years' time start a family. So what they had with this idea was to sell their existing house and use the equity, which is about 250,000 now, to put as a deposit on the new house. Now, I advised them that it wasn't a good idea to sell the first house and just buy a new house for a higher value. And they're probably surprised that I mentioned this to them, because they're both high earners in professional careers, and they probably can't see a problem ahead. I'm not saying I can see problems, but what I do know is that when Elon Musk mentioned recently that in 5 years' time, because of AI, robots, automation, no one will have a job. I'm not saying that will come true. I don't think that is true. But I do think there's going to be a lot of people losing their jobs, and probably a lot of new jobs created, because that's what normally happens with technological innovation. But I think now we're getting to the stage of robots and AI. This might, for the first time ever, we might have a technological innovation that leads to widespread unemployment. So I think you've got to plan ahead. It's very difficult when you're in your 20s to think that far ahead, because they've only ever known full employment, and it's hard to imagine this. And I'm not saying this will happen necessarily, but it could. So I always take the view you should have passive income to help you in case you get into financial difficulty. You've always got a source of income that will keep coming in if you lose your main job, for example. Now, if this couple do decide to start a family, probably one of them will go part-time, maybe give up their job altogether. What happens if the remaining breadwinner gets made redundant because their job has been taken over by AI? Suddenly got no income, and you might have to sell your dream home. So I know it might seem unduly pessimistic, and I'm not saying this will happen. It might not, but it could. I said to them, why don't you just release the equity from a mortgage, increase your mortgage on your existing property, and use the equity released from the mortgage to invest the deposit in the new property. Now, let me give you some of the figures here. We're talking about a house that's now worth 485,000. The mortgage on it is 235,000. So they've built up a lot of equity in just a few years. They spent a lot of time and effort doing this property up. So £250,000 of equity is pretty good in your late 20s. Now, they could have put that into the new house, but the new house is costing £810,000. That's a lot of money to invest in a property that won't give them any income, and will only cost them money to buy and cost them money to maintain. So I said, why don't you instead get a further advance from your lender, existing lender, on your first house, release equity from the mortgage, and I calculated that they could raise 125,000, let's say, approximately. So they could use that money to put a deposit on the new house. It's half of what they would have put down. So the deposit is smaller. Their mortgage on the new house by selling the first house would have been £570,000. But now it would increase their mortgage to around about 700,000. Now you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, why are you advising them to take on a bigger mortgage and not sell the first house? Well, don't forget, if they keep the first house, they will be able to let it out, get rental income, passive income that would survive even if one or both of them were made redundant. So the passive income will more than cover the mortgage payments on their existing house. And the mortgage payments on the existing house are quite high. They're about $2,400 a month. But what you got to remember is that when you have a buy-to-let property, normally the mortgage is interest only, which reduces the cost quite a lot. Now, you'd have to get your lender's consent. They may not agree to it, in which case you just go to a new lender. They'll let you borrow 75% loan to value, as opposed to a home you buy to live in, where they'll lend you typically up to 90%. So if they could get this mortgage, this bigger mortgage than they've got at the moment on their existing property, then they'll be able to borrow roughly £360,000 and make it interest only, which means that the mortgage payments fall from £2,400 a month on the first property to £1,200 a month, interest only. And the rent they could receive on their existing property, they've estimated at £1,800 a month. So that's income at £1,800 a month, mortgage payment £1,200 a month. Well, okay, that looks like a good deal to me, because what you've got to then compare it to is what will be the mortgage payments on the new property if they sold the first house or if they kept it. Now, if they sold the house and put down a bigger deposit on the new property, then their mortgage payments would be £2,800 a month, because when you are buying a home to live in, the lender won't let you have interest-only mortgage, very rarely. You have to pay capital repayment and pay the mortgage off during the mortgage term, typically. So it would cost £2,800. Now, if they kept the first property and released less equity from the mortgage rather than from the house sale, then their mortgage payments would be approximately £3,400 a month. So £600 more to pay on the new property if they keep the first property. But remember what I said earlier. If they kept the first property, the rental income would be £1,800 a month and the mortgage payment would be £1,200 a month. So they would make £600 a month from the buy-to-let, and the mortgage on the new house would be £600 a month more. Now, I admit this is a simple example. I'm not taking account of taxes, because there's bigger stamp duties to pay on a second home than on just a single home that you own, admittedly, and there would be tax to pay on the rental income. So it is a bit simplistic. My figures may not be 100% accurate, but you get the gist. Now, what it would mean is that instead of them now owning one property worth 810,000, they'd own two properties worth 1.285 million. And get this, they haven't got a mortgage to pay on the first property. You're probably looking at me thinking, he's talking rubbish now. No, I mean, the tenant will pay the mortgage. That's the beauty. And what's going to happen to the value of the first property? It'll go up in value, won't it? They probably will. They usually do, UK house prices, particularly when there's more demand than supply, with a huge amount of excess net immigration to the UK. That's likely to continue that trend. Maybe not as high as in the past, but you're still going to get probably more immigrants than emigrants, just different types of immigrants and emigrants. And so that means if the demand is still going to be high, the likelihood is that they won't get many gap periods where they don't get any rental income between tenancies, and the rent will probably keep rising over the years. But on top of that, capital value, you're looking at combined two properties worth roughly 1.3 million compared to 800,000. Well, they're going to make far more wealth over the years to come from the two properties rather than one. Now, the reason I feel quite strongly about this subject is because I myself, who've rarely ever sold a freehold in my life, but I did sell a property which I bought many years ago for £37,250. We sold it 6 or 7 years later for around about 70,000, I seem to recall. But if we'd kept that property, remember the tenant would have paid the mortgage for us. The mortgage was quite small, 33,000. By now, the mortgage would have been paid off, and that house is worth £350,000 now. I really regret selling that house because we would have had a huge gain on it. And I see the same advantage for this young professional couple. Obviously, they can't really see it yet, and that's quite normal. People don't see it, and they can see it as a risk. They had the typical objections you get. One of them said, "Oh, what about the hassle of tenants?" Well, I've been letting out property for 30 odd years. I don't generally get problems with tenants. If you pick your tenants carefully, make sure they're a professional couple, that are not on, for me, it would be not being on benefits. It would be non-smokers, no pets. That's what I prefer. And as a result, I've rarely had any problems. And if there have been any complaints, it's usually justified. Something's broken, it needs fixing, or the house needs redecorating. Well, I always pay for those things and correct them. I like to have happy tenants. And the other objection was, the stamp duty is a lot more. I've got to pay £70,000 rather than £30,000. Yes, that's a lot of money, admittedly. But in the scheme of things, remember, you're retaining an asset that's worth £485,000. Admittedly, there'd be a mortgage on it, but the money you'll make out of that 485,000, both in terms of capital growth and rental income, increases over the years, far outweigh an extra £40,000 in stamp duty today, which I admit is very, very high. And this kind of strategy, because I believe that most people during a working lifetime will probably live in, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 properties. You know, you'll move every now and again. And if you just to rinse and repeat, use the same strategy every time you move, don't sell the first house or the second house or the third house, always raise a mortgage on it, release the equity, make sure there's enough rental income to cover the new increased mortgage, turn it into an interest-only mortgage with the consent of the lender, and then move on. And if you use this strategy and rinse and repeat a few times, let's say you do it 5 times during your working lifetime, by the time you're retired, you won't own 1 property, you'll own 5. And those 5 properties, who knows how much they could be worth? They might be worth 2 million, 3 million, 5 million. And if you also maximize your contributions into your workplace pensions, then just by being employed, assuming you're lucky enough to keep your job till retirement age, maxing out your pensions, buying properties occasionally whenever you move house, you'll be very wealthy, my friend. And that's the way to do it.